Hey everybody, welcome to Q Plus EDU. My name is Frederick, my pronouns are they, them, and I am Out Youth's Texas Gender and Sexuality Alliance Network Coordinator. I'm thrilled to have you here tonight for our final session of Q Plus EDU for the summer. This is Educators' Rights Surrounding Queerness. We're super excited to have this conversation. The idea for this panel was one of the things that kicked off Q Plus EDU way back last fall when we were conceptualizing what this could look like. And there's a lot of different topics to cover in this, especially in Texas. And so I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for our panelists to share their expertise. And so I will go ahead and kick it over to y'all to introduce yourselves. If you could tell us your name and your pronouns and where you're situated in relation to schools in Texas. And Michael, we can start with you.
Okay, my name is Michael Alvarez. I go by he, him, él pronouns. And my experience with Texas schools is I went through them basically since I was in like 4th grade. I've been attending schools in San Antonio, SAISD specifically, and I am a graduate from Burbank High School.
Great, thank you. Natalie?
Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Natalie Clifford. My pronouns are she, her, and ella. I have lived in San Antonio for the last 3 years, and so I teach high school ESL, English as Second Language, to newcomer bilingual youth here. And I am actually not from here. I'm originally from Minneapolis, but excited to be here and just very proud of the conversation that lies ahead.
Great, thank you. Brian?
Hi, everyone. My name is Brian Closterborg. My pronouns are he, him, his. I am an attorney with the ACLU of Texas, based in our Houston office, but I actually grew up in Round Rock, Texas, and went to public schools there. Currently, I work a lot on LGBTQ rights, and particularly we represent trans and non-binary students, and also their parents and guardians, trying to navigate the public school system, and when necessary, filing complaints on their behalf if people face problems or challenges. So it's good to be with you all, and also to talk more about the teacher side of things, as well as keeping in mind our students.
Fantastic, thank you, Brian. So to kick it off, I think, Brian, you'll probably be the most equipped to talk about this from the legal side. What legal protections do LGBTQ plus educators have?
So the good news is that now there's quite a lot, and the protections are increasingly robust. Briefly, I kind of wanted to share with people the story of Stacey Bailey, who is an art teacher in Arlington, Texas. So a few years ago, before the kind of landmark Supreme Court decision this summer, Stacey Bailey was an art teacher at an elementary school in Mansfield ISD. And in 2017, when she was introducing herself to her 4th grade class at the start of the school year, she showed a picture of her and her partner, her fiance, dressed for Halloween. Unfortunately, just that simple picture of showing and talking about a part of her life led to a parent complaint, and parents actually trying to get her ousted from her position. And the district and her supervisors at work did take retaliatory actions against her. And so she actually ended up filing a lawsuit. And thankfully, the district court in the Northern District of Texas near Dallas found that she had a right to be free from discrimination in the workplace. And she ended up getting a settlement of $100,000 from her district to pay her for the discrimination that took place. And so even before the landmark decisions this summer, most public school teachers in Texas under the US Constitution have a right to be free from discrimination. So a lot of you will know that this summer, there were a couple of cases on Title VII, which is the federal non-discrimination employment law, which really, in some amazing decision, found that all LGBTQ people, including those who are transgender, have a right to be free from discrimination at work. So as long as you work for a company that has at least 15 employees, you have a right to be free from discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity. And that Title VII applies to every public school in Texas, as well as the Constitution. So the Constitution applies whenever the government is the one engaging in discrimination. So any public school student or teacher is protected by the Constitution, and then the teachers are also protected by Title VII. There still is a little bit of a gray area with private schools and especially religious schools. So this summer there was also a Supreme Court case called Our Lady of Guadalupe School about a Catholic school teacher. And the Supreme Court there said that if a teacher at a private religious school is teaching religion and leading students in prayer, then they fall under what's called the ministerial exception to Title VII. And unfortunately, the court there said that teachers at these private Catholic schools can be discriminated against because Title VII doesn't protect them. So there is still some areas of private religious schools that we're pushing back on that, and we're trying to narrow that, because that exception is supposed to apply to ministers. And the idea that anyone at a Catholic school or anyone at a Catholic hospital or religious entity is a minister is a little bit ridiculous. Like even the custodial staff are, are teaching people about religion. Anyway, so there still is some gray area, but the good news is the protections statewide are very robust, that you have a right to be yourself at work and you can't be discriminated against based on your LGBTQ identity.
Thanks, Brian. That's really helpful. Where does Title IX come into play with this? And is it applicable at all in these situations of discrimination?
So Title IX protects primarily students, but really anyone also at a institution that receives federal funding. So that also is a very important federal statute. And one thing we want to emphasize is that trans and non-binary students, as well as all LGBTQ students, have been winning almost every single court case they have brought. Just this week, Gavin Grimm won yet another major court victory in his ongoing case to be allowed to use the bathroom and facilities that align with his gender identity. So really across the country, the case law on Title IX and the Constitution has really gotten better and better. Unfortunately, here in Texas, we don't have a lot of court cases directly on point, but there is kind of a growing consensus across the country that LGBTQ students have the right in school to be called by the affirming name and pronouns, to use the bathroom and locker room facilities that align with their gender identity, not to be bullied, harassed, or discriminated against, and that things like gender-specific dress and grooming codes that don't necessarily make room for trans or non-binary students are invalid under the Constitution.
That's super helpful. And I know that before the panel started, we were also talking about how those gender-specific dress and grooming codes are also generally very race-based as well, and how they disproportionately affect people of color and LGBTQ folks additionally. So I think it's really important to recognize those wins where we can get them. Michael, I want to ask, when you were going through the public school system, were you familiar with your school's policies regarding like harassment, bullying? And if so, how did you become familiar with those policies? And do you feel like they were enforced?
Yeah, no, I actually was remembering the first time that I ever saw any sort of policy, and it was not until high school. I've been a part of Texas public school since I was in 4th grade, and it wasn't until high school, probably like my senior year, whenever emails are being sent like left and right, and it was only in that small print at the end of the email that sends with every teacher's emails, the non-discrimination clause that every school is supposed to have. And that was the only time that I was ever aware that we even had a policy that protected queer students. And it was nice to see as a high schooler that I was protected, but I had been bullied since I was in 4th grade. I was queer long before then, and I didn't feel that sort of protection. And I don't think it was enforced, and I think that's because it's not strong enough. Teachers are not obligated to report any sort of discrimination against LGBTQ students, or they just don't. And that's my experience.
Thanks for sharing that. I appreciate your vulnerability. I think one of the things that we have seen repeatedly in the research is the importance of not only having robust, inclusive, enumerated non-discrimination and anti-harassment, anti-bullying policies, but also the professional development and training for all school staff to be able to enforce those rules. And so it can't only fall on the teachers. The custodial staff, the bus drivers have to be trained to intervene when they witness these things. Michael, do you remember if any of the teachers that you had in your public school education were out as LGBTQ? And if so, do you remember like what your perception as a student was of them and what your perception of how other teachers saw them was?
Yes, I believe that this is extremely important. I never had any queer teachers that I knew of, but when I attended high school, we had 2 staff members that were queer and open about it. And I just remember wanting to have their classes. Like, I know one of them was an art teacher. Sadly, he left before I even was able to take an art class with him. But I think just him being out and that being something that everybody knew was something that helped a queer student like me think that I had a place where I was in school and that I had a future, you know? The other teachers' perceptions of them were not always the best. I would hear like discrimination against them, and like many students would like talk about it, and that is just disgusting to me. I don't know. I don't really have any other stories besides that.
Yeah, that is really unfortunate. And definitely, like, if you, as a queer student, obviously, if you're hearing teachers, making homophobic or transphobic remarks about other teachers, you're certainly not going to feel safe being yourself around those teachers. Yeah, that's a big deal. Natalie, as an educator, what's your experience in the classroom with, I don't know how you identify, but with, teachers being queer, school staff being queer, students being queer, what's your take on it? And then we'll come back to policies.
Yeah, thank you. I really want to say this topic is so important, and personally, it's very important to me because I do identify as queer and queer and cisgender, but sometimes gender expansive or gender nonconforming in my expression or the way that I dress. And so I've only been in San Antonio about 3 years, like I said, but it's definitely been challenging to navigate. Obviously, I know who I am and I'm proud of it, but it's more often these structures that are in place or the lack of protections until very recently that have existed to the point where I haven't felt safe to be specifically out in every space, although I've very much worked to create inclusive spaces for students and inclusive texts and building that into the classroom as part of our community. The problem with that when there have not been these protections is that it promotes, unfortunately, a lack of authenticity in some ways, right? And so being authentic is so important as an educator in order to connect with your students and build strong relationships. And I really value that a lot. And so that has been painful at times for me when I knew who I was and I didn't have an issue with myself, but it was more for feeling unsupported in various environments where I've worked. I will say that in the last year to 2 years, I became really involved with my union, which really helped me out a lot because I learned a lot of my rights, or I learned how to navigate those situations a little bit more effectively, I guess you could say, with self-confidence and not really, I don't know how to say it, but not really allowing, or I don't want that to sound victim blaming, or not I should say, knowing how to respond to the kinds of situations in which I did not feel or which I felt were hostile. So becoming involved with my union has really helped me a lot because, for example, I had shared this with Michael the other day that one school I tried to start a GSA, and I thought I prepared a good presentation, but was essentially told that's not something we're concerned about here, and that was a bit of a shock for me. But I ended up transferring to a different school later, and I learned that time around that I needed to have everything in a row so I could demonstrate I was really educated about the policies and the federal Equal Access Act. I looked up on GLSEN's website, and I really kind of developed my confidence in that time in my voice as an educator to articulate that it was extremely important for students, because not only for myself, but really for students, because of the things that Michael mentions where students need to be able to see a future for themselves, and they need to be able to see that that we exist in the world because we've been here for a long time, centuries or more. And so all that to say, I would say it's been complex. It's definitely been challenging at various points, but in the end, I've been grateful to have really educated myself, and that's kind of been my armor in a lot of situations, is to have the knowledge of the policies more than anyone else in the room, so that I could move forward with what was needed for my students. So yeah.
Thank you, Natalie. I think you raise a good point. Like unfortunately, the position of a lot of marginalized communities is that need to be armed with knowledge so that we can defend ourselves, and I think that's true for people of color under, our white supremacist society. I think that's true for LGBTQ folks in our, cis het dominant society. You mentioned, having to be super knowledgeable about the policies at your school and in your district. What are your school and your district's current policies in regards to LGBTQ plus folks, and are they different for students versus school personnel?
Yeah, I'm nodding my head because I love this question, because I'm proud that I know the answer to it because I've had to learn it. And so right now, there is, I always, to your point, I think for folks with various identities that have been marginalized, we have to do that extra work to learn these things for our own protection. So everywhere I've worked in my life, I always read the non-discrimination statement immediately before I sign, knowing that it's probably not going to be there, but just so I can know. In its current state, from the last time I had checked, in my particular school district, our students are actually protected from discrimination based on, I believe, sexual orientation. I don't believe based on gender identity or expression. Employees are not protected on any of those. However, when the Supreme Court case did come out, as Brian was referencing, that gave me a lot of courage to know that ultimately I can refer back to that as the federal law of the land that really has the final say. And so, although, as I'm sure folks could read up, it's not, but it was a huge deal, and it's also not, we don't want to always just depend on the law to save us, right? So because people have fought for these things, right? Have fought to change these laws that it's not always reflective of what we know to be justice, right? And so, so having that Supreme Court case ruling, with all of that being said, really made me very emotional, because I felt even if that's not specifically written into policies in a lot of our districts, I feel like now as a union person, I know my ropes enough to be able to refer back to that as a point for, for our students and for our staff. But really, I really think our well-being is very connected. Student and staff well-being is very connected. And so I don't always like to, there's often ways that it's separated, as if, well, what's good for teachers is over here and what's good for students. But I think in these kinds of cases, we can see that it's really deeply connected. The more that we can support our students allows also our staff to then be thriving, and vice versa.
Absolutely. I think it's, it's disheartening to see that, the district went through the trouble of being considerate of students and writing those anti-discrimination policies to be, as inclusive as they are, and didn't think to afford their, school personnel, school staff, the same protections. Like it's either a glaring omission, or it's, more than negligence. It almost feels punitive. I can't think of the right word, but it definitely feels uncomfortable as someone who is not even employed by the school. So I can't imagine how you feel about it. One of the things that I wanted to make sure to ask y'all, so we had a panel last week on integrating queer content into curriculum. And it was a conversation about how educators can bring, queer role models, queer content, just in general, into their curriculum. But are there legal concerns surrounding educators' integration of queer topics or conversations into the curriculum? And if so, how can teachers navigate those legal concerns? What rights do educators have with regard to kind of freedom of speech or freedom to decide their own curriculum? And I'll pass that to whoever wants to answer first.
I'm happy to start, but I'm curious to hear your all's thoughts as well. So legally, teachers don't really have like pure free speech rights in the classroom as fully or as robustly as they do outside the classroom. And also, teachers tend to have a little bit more limited rights than students. So students tend to have a lot more free speech rights inside the classroom. That's partly because sometimes when teachers are teaching, especially things like curriculum, that's sometimes considered employer speech. Like it's really speech on behalf of the district, and kind of you're imparting knowledge to the students. And it's a little bit of a tricky area, even for us at the ACLU. Normally we're all about free speech, and we really like unbridled kind of free speech. But particularly teachers in a classroom setting, we do hear a lot of complaints from students where teachers actually say things that are either racist or homophobic or transphobic. And, especially when we talk about things like sex ed, which I think we'll talk about a little more later, it's like there's a lot of negative information being imparted in these classrooms. So it's like we try to, in a way, we want teachers to be creative with how can you include LGBTQ content and materials kind of within the confines or within the scope of what the school allows. There is the Texas Educators Code of Ethics, explicitly says that teachers must treat either fellow faculty and staff and also students. They can't discriminate or treat people disrespectfully based on race, gender, sexual orientation is explicitly covered. Gender identity is not explicitly in the Texas Educators Code of Ethics, but as Natalie was saying, just because something's not in there doesn't mean you don't have like a legal argument that it is. So like the fact that the Code of Ethics, covers sex, the US Supreme Court has now said that discriminating against someone because they're transgender or because of their sexual orientation is inherently and intrinsically a form of sex discrimination. So the good news is there is some differentiation we're able to do. Like if an educator, says something homophobic or transphobic in the classroom, there are certain bases that even you as a peer could point out to your district. Like there's a certain standard that we have to treat everyone with respect and dignity, and we can't be harassing our students or each other. But we're limited by the curriculum. I know that I turn it over to you all, to Natalie and Michael, if you have any thoughts about how you deal with that creatively when you have things like the TEKS that you have to teach, or you have the curriculum that absolutely doesn't have any queer content in it, but maybe there's ways with what you're given that you can somehow include it or create space for discussion amongst your students.
So what I would like to say is that my experience in high school, especially with history, queer history is something that isn't taught to students. And we all know that Texas public schools are, lacking in the history department because it's basically a monopoly that they're working off of, and it's very what is it? It's very Republican. The vote for like what gets to be published and what gets to be taught throughout of our schools, and so that does not leave a lot of room for queer people. It does not leave a lot of room for people of color, and they often get left out of the story. But I was fortunate enough to have teachers that were creative, and the issues that the issue of not having queer text and not having text about students that look like us, you know, Hispanic students that are important and historical figures, but were not included in the TEKS. They took it upon themselves to say, this is important for my students to hear, this is important for me, so I would, along with the TEKS, like to teach this. And it's more work for sure for the teachers, but I think that's one of the most noble things that they've ever done for me, and it really helped form me as a person. So.
Yeah, I would add to the great things that's been said already that first, of course, you know, real quick to address as far as the policy question goes, that change precedes me, and so I'm not sure the rationale behind that. I do know that Michael's school district, actually, due to youth activism, they advocated to get a non-discrimination clause for the staff around, I believe, sexual orientation and gender identity, if I'm not mistaken. So student activism, I think, is really important, and I should even say organizing. And so as far as the question of curriculum goes, I'm fortunate in that I teach in the English department, which is a very open, you know, open type of, I guess you could say open-ended type of skills that students need to learn. So we have a lot of freedom in terms of the text that we choose. And I'm very fortunate also that I have a very supportive staff at the district level for that department who very on a personal level really cares about our communities. And so I would say that it is more work, like Michael said, but it is the right thing to do. And so as far as it goes, we know that education is political, right? Because of the reasons that Michael said, that the decisions made about what gets taught are made by people far away from education, who have never been in education oftentimes, and or have some form of vested interest in often silencing a lot of these histories. And so as far as what's available, one thing that I always would recommend for educators, and something that we've done in my experience the last few years, has been to create a common agreement that then you provide to parents and guardians to inform them that they can opt out of certain kinds of texts. You know, I teach at the high school level, so for example, we created a statement that we all used across, so it wasn't just, you know, me or one other teacher, that said, you know, this year we may be discussing or reading texts that include themes such as LGBTQ identities, racism, harassment, bullying, violence, you know, anything that we might cover that are mature themes, but that we emphasize it ties back to these academic goals, like Brian was saying. And so there is a way, and again, this is just part of my union brain, is it's always about kind of, you know, documenting for your own self and proving that you are tying it back to some sort of academic standard, but there's a lot of room for that if you, you know, you have to put in the work, but it does pay off well for students, as long as you can, you know, cross your T's, dot your I's, and show that you are teaching the things you're supposed to be teaching, as far as the goals, or the TEKS, for those who are not educators, are like the state standards for what's expected for students to know. But there are a lot of ways where it can be presented such that you know, you provide the information, build that trust with parents and guardians, right? And you get them to opt in or out. Most of the time they opt in, I think, at least in my experience, because I do think that parents often recognize their students are navigating this world, this society, where especially 2020 is like a perfect example of a lot of things that have been already structures of oppression and violence that are kind of movements are coming to the surface, right? And so I always think, as an educator, it's our ethical responsibility to do the right thing and have those discussions with our students, because they're already thinking about them, whether we're part of that conversation or not. And I'd much rather be part of the dialogue with them and learn from them. And so I think there are ways to navigate it. It is more work, but it is possible.
That's awesome. Thank you, Natalie. I love the idea of like your department-wide or your school-wide, developing these relationships with parents to where it's based on trust and it's based on the fact that, they're sending their kids to this school for a reason, because they want them to have this well-rounded education. I'm curious, we mentioned TEKS, Brian brought up sex education. For folks who may not know, the State Board of Education is voting next week on the sex ed TEKS, on the statewide curriculum standards. They will be voting on how to update sex education for the state for the first time since 1997, when Titanic was in the theater, for some perspective. Registration to testify at the State Board of Education meeting opens on the 3rd, and we strongly encourage all members of the LGBTQ community in Texas to testify to the importance of comprehensive and inclusive sex education. I will step off my soapbox, but as things stand, what rights do educators have regarding not just teaching like sex education, but like to bring up, the fact that Virginia Woolf was, part of the LGBTQ plus community, that, to use examples like, Jose and Mario got a mortgage together in math class. What kind of rights do educators have to be intentional about bringing queerness into the conversation?
Well, I would say as an educator, you always have that right, but you have to be really ready. You got to be prepared and you got to know your rights, and you have to, before you even do it, have it probably all typed out as to what your possible response would be around whatever, pushback you could get. And Brian can speak more as far as the legal ramifications as far as that goes, like you mentioned with free speech. But I strongly would encourage any educator who is working to be inclusive, whether you're part of our community or other communities or not, to do that work, and to always, I think it always can be successful if it's framed as what's best for the students, because it's also just true. These are the things that are best for our youth, because they are experiencing these things, they're witnessing them, whether in person or online. They're going through who knows what oftentimes. And so I always recommend that educators, as long as we can position that we are doing things for the benefit of the students, for the growth of the students, whether it's through TEKS or looking even through the counseling departments, they have technically state standards, I believe, that they're supposed to convey to students and help them learn social emotional standards. There are a lot of ways that that educators can connect those kinds of decisions back to goals for becoming good people, which I hope is often our goal in education, although that's not, we don't all necessarily have the same perspective, but for me personally, that's a goal. And so I would say making decisions like that I encourage it, but also, as has been mentioned, and I was just on a call about this earlier, that knowing that when you are that type of educator who values that, you are putting yourself out there, and the reaction could be varied. But I really think it's important to find support from other educators on that campus. Like I said, I've referenced, so that you're not feeling like the only one carrying that. And the more that you can, connect that to colleagues and encourage them also to do that. I really believe in organizing as a union person. I think it's always more effective when we can, in more than one individual can advocate for things, so that people don't pinpoint it as like, that's just your opinion or preference, which obviously that's not how I see it, but so that people can see this is a value that we have as a department or a campus, or just this connects to these kinds of goals. So, but Brian could probably say more around the legal side, or Michael might want to add something too.
Michael, do you want to go first with any of your thoughts on sex ed? Okay, I'll go. So yeah, I totally agree with what Natalie has said. And that's something we always encourage our students too, is like finding whatever allies, co-conspirators you can in whatever environment you're in. Last week, there was a situation in Roma, Texas, where a teacher in her virtual classroom had a Black Lives Matter sign, as well as like an LGBTQ supportive sign, just in her virtual classroom, and had a picture of it. And that screenshot was taken by a political candidate who's very anti-LGBT and kind of blasted onto the internet. And she ended up getting a lot of like hate messages, and the school district temporarily placed her on administrative leave. But then within hours and within days, over 10,000 people supported her by signing a petition. Teachers were organizing and community members to make sure she was reinstated. And there was nothing wrong with having those supportive messages for her students in her classroom. And it's really things that shouldn't even really be controversial. And I think, Frederick, the examples you used of if a teacher is giving hypothetical examples of a lesbian couple or a pansexual couple or a trans student, those things should not be controversial. It's just a fact of life that LGBTQ people exist and have legal rights. And I think, as Natalie said, the more you know, you could fall back on some things like the Texas Educators Code of Ethics. And that could be something saying, oh, well, like, I was just trying to treat everyone with dignity and respect, as I'm required to do by this code of ethics that we're all supposed to be following. I think sex ed is a particularly difficult area, and I don't know, the best area, the way for, sex educators in Texas to push back on this. Of course, like you said, testifying and trying to change the TEKS would be super helpful. And currently, Texas law still has some really outdated and homophobic language, where the Texas Health and Safety Code actually still requires that sex ed instruction and course materials be, quote, provided in a way that shows that homosexuality is, quote, not an acceptable lifestyle to the general public, and that homosexual conduct is a criminal offense under the penal code. So of course, this has not been true since at least 2003, when Lawrence versus Texas said that all these criminal laws on homosexuality were unconstitutional. But we still have these like sex ed laws on the books in Texas. But every other state across the country has found that these were unconstitutional. Every time they've been challenged in court, they're like so clearly unconstitutional that the courts have unanimously found them to be so, but they still exist. So that is one thing, just like as a heads up, if you are an educator and you ever encounter these like blatantly homophobic laws that are used against you, please call Lambda Legal or the ACLU of Texas, reach out to us. These are pieces of the law that still exist, but we hope that they're not ever implemented or enforced. So if your school is requiring you to teach people that homosexuality is not an acceptable lifestyle, that's like a huge red flag that you should reach out to us, because that is something that is challengeable and has been challenged in other states. The main reason it hasn't been challenged in Texas is that, to our knowledge, most school districts in their sex ed curriculum are not including this. Like, it's even like some of the more like out there school districts don't have this specific kind of language anymore. But if you do encounter it, please let us know, because it's something that could be challenged potentially.
But you make a good point, Brian. Like, they're not teaching this because so many school districts in Texas choose not to teach sex ed because they're not required to. Like, that just blows my mind.
Yeah, I can speak a little bit on this because I did actually work for a group called the Youth Advocacy Council, and it was under Healthy Futures of Texas. And it was a bunch of students from San Antonio, so it was like middle to high school students advocating for sex ed curriculum to be included. And we would go and talk to representatives in the Capitol in Austin here. And I think the hardest thing is that we just have so much like conservative like views still being represented and being put forth as our representation as well in our Senate or whatever. And so it makes it really hard, especially when the students are advocating for it. They just seem to not listen or not care. And it's really important, especially with queer folk, to know their protections, because a lot of times it is more dangerous, and so it really is important to have.
Thanks so much, Michael. And I would love if you would drop in the chat that organization that you were working with. I think that's important for folks to know. Are there particular like pre-written curricula on the LGBTQ community that are like safer or easier for teachers to use? I'm thinking about the stuff that's at like teaching tolerance, and because of the way because it's framed as teaching tolerance and it's not GLSEN, it's not quite as glaringly LGBTQ. Are there like curricula like that that are safer and easier for teachers in Texas to use?
Yeah, I think Teaching Tolerance is an excellent resource. There's the Zen Education Project and Teaching for Change. There are a lot of great resources out there that are not necessarily Texas specific, but they find ways to incorporate, LGBTQ folks, Black folks, Latino, Indigenous, Asian American, disabled communities. Every community that's often left out of our curriculum are incorporated into various kinds of lesson plans, whether through almost any content, and developmentally appropriate and age grade. I know that's something people often worry about, or I should say, it's often an argument against LGBTQ folks is folks trying to say it's not developmentally appropriate, when actually there are lots of different ways to present any community, including queer and trans folks, in developmentally appropriate ways. So there are a lot of great resources. I will also say that in terms of the way we've been discussing it, I would really always recommend, just in general, it's best practice to create a safe learning environment, right, for our youth. And so from that perspective, as Brian and Mike were both expressing, I think always pivoting back to that, this is a youth safety issue. When I proposed our Gender and Sexuality Alliance last year, I looked up the statistics on attendance, and because we know our queer and trans youth experience disproportionate houselessness or homelessness, and mental health issues, and how school, if it's not a safe place, can impact that. There's a lot of different data out there, not that we should need that, but it is, just the reality to I hate to say argue, but to remind people why it's important to include these different communities. And so whether it's the attendance, homelessness, these are things that, districts are invested in, and I mean, as they should be, but I think that in terms of resources, there's a lot out there. It just it does take that extra work, because it's not designed that way, right? A lot of our curriculum and our state standards are not set up to facilitate that. So that's why it takes that extra work. But I think if someone is an educator and they're truly in it because they really deeply care about youth, like I always say, I'm a teacher, I work for the people, right? I work for my kids. That's who I care about the most. And I'm gonna do that extra work because it's the right thing to do. And I don't wanna have them ever have to think back that they didn't see somebody like themselves from whatever community they're like. So there's a lot. I can type them in the chat for folks if they haven't heard of them. So yeah.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you, Natalie. I think your comment about like student safety is so important. And I do just want to throw out for folks that if you are in Texas and you have questions about Gender and Sexuality Alliance clubs, if you want to start a GSA, if you're getting pushback about a GSA, please reach out to me directly. I'll type my email in the chat, but it's frederick@txgsa.org. That's what I do, is help with GSAs. So I want to, it's adjacent, but I want to move to a different question. In what ways can teachers intervene to protect students, whether they're being bullied or harassed at school, or if they're facing abuse at home?
I say that a really important thing is to just communicate with these students, because especially in times where queer students are talking to their teachers about issues that they're having with their parents for not understanding their sexual identity or perhaps their gender identity, these situations can get really dangerous, because a lot of times parents would want to kick out their son or daughter for not identifying as straight or cis, and things like that are really scary for somebody who's so young. And so sometimes just being able to talk through a child about what their options are is something that's so important and so impactful.
Yeah, I think the bullying question is one of the hardest that we see and deal with. It's so important though to have teachers and educators who are helping and like monitoring and aware and like receiving an appropriate training. So every school legally has an obligation to curtail bullying and harassment, but they almost like every time we see it, they're almost never doing enough or being as helpful as they could be or should be. They especially kind of conflate what's general, general things that people say as young people to their friends with like gender-based harassment. So the big difference for LGBTQ people is that, similar to like race discrimination or other types of discrimination that's about your identity, it's something you can't change. So just calling someone a jerk or a name is like fundamentally different than like attacking someone as a component of their identity. And bullying, by definition, always has like a power dynamic involved, that there is a power differential between the person doing the bullying and being bullied, whether it's cyber or in person. And so we always encourage educators, teachers, other students, when you see this happening, to do whatever you can to restore the power balance or to change those dynamics in some way, to take that power away from the bully, whether it's other people in the classroom who are saying, no, trans lives matter, Black lives matter, we won't stand up, we won't allow this kind of speech to be used, or the teacher creating that space from the beginning, creating those expectations early on, that's saying this is a place where all of our identities will be cherished and valued. Because once it gets like really bad, it's typically, as Michael was saying, it gets really bad. And it's like, so, starting early on to set those expectations and to curtail from the beginning is really helpful. And then briefly, like on what Michael was saying about, often teachers will find themselves being maybe the only confidant of a student and being maybe the first person that people talk to about these issues. But it's tough because technically under FERPA, which is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, parents and guardians typically have the right to any information or documents about their student. And so this is actually one area where you might even, normally Natalie is like 100% right. You should normally document absolutely everything for your own protection. But also in this particular area, just being cognizant that if a student's coming to you and talking about their home life, if you're creating documents or notes or records, that you might have to turn those records over to the parent or guardian. And so just being a little bit careful that technically the student doesn't always have their own right to confidentiality, that their legal rights are tied to their parents or guardian. At the same time, you're not completely defenseless because Texas law also requires people to report any suspicion of abuse or neglect at home. And the Child Protective Services and Family Protective Services, they do take LGBTQ cases and they do take reports of people who are abusing or neglecting their child based on queer identity. So it's not perfect. They have a lot of work to improve upon, and ideally it never gets to that point, because if it's at that point where you're reporting something, it's probably really, really bad. And hopefully they can you can find ways to work with the student to maybe navigate out of that crisis and that environment. But just knowing that you're not powerless in that situation, that you and your school have an obligation to protect your students, even if that means getting other people involved. And licensed counselors have a little bit more legal protections than a teacher does. So that can be one avenue to encourage your students to try to talk to someone who's like a licensed therapist. But sometimes that's not always available because we currently have more police officers in schools than we have counselors, unfortunately.
You tell them, Brian. Yeah, I think, so let me throw a hypothetical at you, Natalie. So let's say you have a student who has come out to you as trans and they're out to their peers as well. And so in your classroom, they are going by their chosen name, they're going by their correct pronouns, and their parent finds out and, comes to the school and says, I don't want you calling my child this. I don't want you, encouraging my child to, be transgender. How do you, as an educator, navigate that? What do you like? Obviously, your priority as an educator is the child and their safety and well-being. How do you navigate that situation and focus on their safety while also keeping your job and keeping the parents from freaking out on the administration?
Yeah, I think this is really important to talk about because I think we see, yet again, it's kind of an example of, some of the things Brian's describing in terms of just really the limitations of these structures, right, that exist in our society. For example, folks who, maybe queer or trans identified or perceived as such that experience bullying, we do want to keep them safe, and that's a mandate that we have. And at the same time, we don't want to over criminalize, right, other youth, especially Black youth, Latino youth who disproportionately experience. So it's kind of like there's this tension, right? And then as far as the youth goes themselves, I will say that we have dealt with situations kind of like this in terms of with the GSA that we started last year. We did emphasize to students, and again, this is just because I'm very, going to have the right, everything, very particular, but it's for preserving student safety, that we had students who wanted to, who when they would enter the room, they had to sign a confidentiality agreement that we looked through, kind of trying to model off to have language that was focused on explaining to the youth in that room that we take that very seriously, the confidentiality, not taking pictures, social media posting about who was there. They don't sign anything, like Brian said, so it's not like anywhere written down that they've been there. And that we really talked through that with the youth. And so we've had situations before where there were students who were out at school and not at home. I haven't personally run yet, the knock on wood, into the situation that you described. I think because I do want to give our youth credit. They're, how would you say? They're brilliant at surviving, right? I mean, people who know their own life circumstances know how to navigate those situations. And I think that you find ways to do that. But if that, situation were to occur, I think there's always, there's always just the importance of ultimately preserving that student's safety. And that can be argued not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. Their safety is paramount. And them knowing who they are and being able to either express that or have that affirmed, or both, has to be at the center. And I have to say, granted, I don't know the full, as far as the legal side of where then that would take us as a next step, but I think it's really important for educators to, again, in any of these kind of situations where you're trying to be a person who does the right thing, you're going to run into, unfortunately, these limitations and barriers and obstacles with that. And there's risk involved in that. And that's something I have had to realize myself, but at the end of the day, I have to, I don't know how else to say it, but it's just that a young person's life really matters, right? And so I haven't been to that extreme of it yet, but I mean, we have been in situations where it's, the students are not out, and there's an understanding there that, that we as the adults are there to affirm and support that student and protect their confidentiality, even amongst the club, like I said, where we don't keep track and have a sign-in so that it can't be traced back if that student needed to, for some reason, protect themselves from that information getting out there. So we try to find ways, like Brian said, to prevent it from really being written down or recorded. I don't know if that's probably not a super helpful answer, because it's not a situation that is super clear to navigate, but I would hope that an educator in that situation would argue for the mental and emotional safety of that student as best that they could.
Yeah, thank you. Brian, I know that you had mentioned that students have a right to be called by their name and their, their correct pronouns. How does that come into play if their parents aren't supportive?
It's really tough. So yeah, as Natalie mentioned, like the law and the structures we have in our society are definitely not always built to protect queer youth, especially. So this is a situation where technically most of your legal rights until you turn 18, unless you're like legally emancipated, belong to your parent or guardian. So you cannot file a lawsuit, sign a contract, or take other legal actions until you reach that age or emancipated, unfortunately. But the school district does have legal obligations. As Natalie mentioned, I think framing it in as a form of safety is totally the way to do it. And this is also where building allies and supporters before things get really bad or before the situation happens would be helpful. Because it's a situation that you probably wouldn't want to be fighting alone. Ideally, you would have a principal or administrator, possibly even the district or the school district's attorney helping out. I mean, in the most supportive, if you have a supportive district, that would probably be the way to go, because it could get a situation where you might have to involve like family protective services, because if the parent or guardian is absolutely not recognizing that person's identity and the person is struggling and they're unsafe, that is a form of abuse or neglect. And that's where I don't know exactly how it would go down, but you would want to get help and talk, and not just take on that huge burden by yourself, because it's really difficult and that's a really tough situation. But there are some options that the district still has a legal obligation to keep that student safe and not be causing them emotional harm, even though the legal rights typically are controlled by the parent or guardian.
That's really good to know. Thanks for that perspective. We did have an audience question that came in ahead of the panel, and I want to make sure that we get to that since we're running out of time. So to switch gears a little bit, what advice would you give an educator who's trying to weigh the pros and cons of coming out at a Catholic school?
Well, I don't have a lot of experience being an educator, but I do have a lot of experience being in the Catholic religion and also being queer. And I think that there are students that are born into Catholic families that are queer, and there are students that identify as Catholic and are also queer. And so any sort of representation really matters. And I know that that's risking a job in a lot of cases where, especially in the Catholic religion, it's not celebrated, it's not usually acknowledged. And so that's really scary. But if you feel that you have queer students and you think and you can grapple that impact that it could have for them, and I think it seems almost unfair not to show who you really are to those students.
Yeah, like I said, the legal landscape is a bit tough. I mean, it really depends on, like, the Supreme Court has given us this like really strange test that really depends on like the amount of religious instruction you're doing. So if it's something in your job where you are teaching, like responsible for teaching like material, like church material to students, then legally you might not have full employment protections like public school teachers do. But that doesn't necessarily mean that things would go really poorly, depending on your school environment, what kind of allies you have. And then as Natalie has stressed, like I would definitely document everything. So whatever you choose to do, make sure you keep a lot of records. Even we have heard about a Catholic basketball coach or a coach who was affiliated with a religious school and was like let go. And then once you're let go, you can be immediately locked out of your email and like kind of lose access to your classroom. So even kind of keeping some records on like your personal email or keeping backups of things to document what happened, just in case you need to file a complaint. And there's also a need for also greater employment protections, like Title VII, this federal law with this ministerial exception. That's just one piece of the law, but Equality Texas, ACLU, Lambda Legal, and other organizations are really pushing for statewide non-discrimination protections here in Texas. Some cities have employment discriminations, so those potentially could reach a little bit farther, but the religious piece is still going to be there, and there will be some anti-LGBT groups really pushing those arguments. But, you know, groups like us are here to help. So feel free to reach out to us if you have more specific questions.
Yeah, I don't have a great response beyond what's been said, except for just I want to express a lot of empathy for the person asking this question, because like Michael, I also have experience being a queer person who was raised quite Catholic, and that is a lot, right, to try to grapple with. For some folks, it's that they identify still as Catholic and as queer. For some folks, they may keep their Catholicism but struggle with the queer part. Some of us, there's other queer folks for whom I think religion is a very sensitive and painful topic often for queer and trans folks for a lot of these kinds of reasons. And so I want to first express sincere empathy, and I see you and I value you, this person who's asking this question. And also, I may not know the details of that, but I know that that is probably a struggle. But I do think that there are changing tides even within religious communities around the country, as we've seen, where there are people who are holding their faith communities accountable for the values professed of equality and justice and fairness. And I think that's not to say I don't know much about this specific community, but I do think there are spaces for people who are part of our queer and trans communities that also are religious and affirming of those identities. And so I would also encourage people who kind of hold both of those things at the same time to look into that. Just Google. I mean, I've done it before, LGBTQ friendly churches or denominations or religions, because there are people out there who are accepting of that. And so beyond what has been said, that those would be just kind of my 2 cents, that you have a right to be who you are, and to examine what that looks like in your current workplace. And if you have the ability to find other spaces, if you're not receiving that affirmation at your workspace, to find religious communities that do affirm that part of you. They do exist, and even here in San Antonio. So I would encourage that for sure.
Thank you so much. I think that's a really important piece, that like there are affirming communities, there are affirming Catholic queer communities as well. It's not posted on our website. The video for it is not posted on our website yet, but Q Plus EDU had a wonderful session on queer-friendly approaches to religion earlier this month. And I learned so much in that conversation about what affirming scriptures look like, both from the Old Testament and the New Testament and the Quran. It was really wonderful. And so I definitely encourage folks who are grappling with their faith and their sexual orientation or their gender identity to seek that one out once it becomes available. I do know that a number of the folks who have participated in Q Plus EDU and in helping out youth and the Texas GSA network with our Stories and Numbers project have been educators at Episcopal schools. And they've done a lot of work with their schools to be affirming and to, because their students are required to go to prayer service every day, they've done a lot of work to make their prayers non-binary, so that it's not, the boys' prayer and the girls' prayer. They've made it, like all of their students. And so there are inroads to be made. And I think that's important to remember. Like it's, if it's important to you, it's important to other people too. And there's always a reason to fight. This has been super helpful, super wonderful. I definitely want to give y'all a chance if you have any closing thoughts for folks. If not, we can close out. But thank you all so much for being here. We really, really appreciate it.
I would just say that being an educator is the greatest honor of my life, and being a queer educator is a beautiful joy for me every day. And I say that, I know it sounds a little bit exaggerated, but honestly, I think it matters a lot. The queer joy matters a lot, and for trans folks as well. Black joy matters, Indigenous communities, like all of these communities of people that are often not seen or represented in our media or in our textbooks. These are all real communities, and we know that, but I think it's very powerful to be able to, for something that once was quite challenging for me a few years ago in some of the circumstances I've personally encountered. I've considered a great honor and responsibility to try to address these things with students now, because I think all of us as adults probably can think to what we might have been like as a child and what we would need. So that's what I often try to reference for myself, is what's my reference point of, what would I have needed as a queer youth, a questioning youth. And I think everybody does that differently, but for educators that are tuned into this, or youth, or community members, I think following that inner compass often is the best thing, and finding other people who align with that is what's been giving me a lot of strength. So find your people, find at least, a few people that value, whether it's who you are or have the same values if you're trying to support, and that will, together we can just do a lot more than just individually trying to fight a lot of these battles. So it's been a great honor to be here.
Yes, I just want to thank you guys so much. More than anything, this has been very educational, especially from you, Brian, with all of the legal end of everything. I now feel like I can, safely, shield myself with that armor that Natalie was talking about, and defend myself in any career or throughout the rest of school. And this is really, it gives me hope, because as a student, I was not ready to be out for a long time. But it's so nice to see that there are educators, that there are other students, and that there are people working in law that care about these issues. And it's just validation, and that's more than I could ever ask for. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you all so much. I draw a lot of hope and inspiration as well from people like you all, and from the students that we work with, and the parents and teachers. And like I said, the trans students across this country are winning like every court case they're bringing, and there is a lot of hope and momentum right now, even though there's so much darkness in the world and times are so difficult in so many ways. That this is one way that, thanks to this, this programming that you all put together, E and Frederick and others, and everyone watching, like, we're all part of this, making this positive change, that our schools, there is a lot of momentum. We have to keep at it, but I'm very hopeful. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Q plus EDU has been a tremendous success. This has been so wonderful. I think our total ended up being 40 different sessions that we had since June. So, bringing together hundreds of queer folks from across Texas and across the country. We had educators from Baltimore joining us on one of our sessions, and so that was really awesome. I did a panel with a friend of mine who's based in California on safety planning around being kicked out. That might be interesting for folks who are watching this one as well, if that's a concern. And, but everything that we've done, from the queer-friendly approaches to religion to understanding the anti-Black roots of queerphobia in this country, to decentering whiteness and queerness, abolishing the police, immigration activism, it's all tied together. And like y'all have said, find your people. Like, the fight is worth it. We're in this together. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. And thank you, E, for organizing.
Yes. All credit to E. Thanks, y'all.